He noticed the perfume before he noticed me. It was the wrong kind for the restaurant. Too floral, too loud against the clink of stemware and the low piano, and it flagged me like a bad note in a song he'd been listening to for years. That's the trouble with working for a man who read people the way other people read newspapers. Everything came labeled, everything filed away in his head under headings I could never quite get to. I pushed my fingers into the silk of the dress and told myself I could be ordinary for one night. The dress was a debt to my own stubbornness. Scarlet, a little dangerous, cut on the bias so that it clung and moved like it had something to hide. I'd bought it on a whim the day I edited a clause out of a contract Lorenzo had sworn was immovable. He'd called it reckless. I'd called it practical. The dress felt like the answer to both. Audacious enough to be noticed, clean enough to be true. Tyler Monroe had picked the place. I'd said yes because I liked his smile in the light, and because there were parts of my life that had to feel normal, if only for a night. There were also parts I wanted to prove I still controlled, my evenings, my choices, the feeling of going out and coming back without report. For 3 years, the office had been a map with a single route. I wanted a side street, even if it was a brief one. The restaurant was the kind of place where velvet booths swallowed sound, and the lighting was flattering in the way that made you feel like you weren't really being looked at, only meant to be seen. Tyler talked, wine flowed, I answered when I felt like it. He was a smooth build-up to the moment I had been worrying about my whole life. The moment someone I didn't want to know me fully realized that I belonged to Lorenzo. He admitted it like an afterthought, a casual tilt that was supposed to make the world right. "I know who you work for," he said, tracing the rim of his glass with his thumb. "Not that it changes anything, of course, but people like me, we're useful. We hear things, we see things. If you wanted, well, you could help." There was a polite smile glued to my face, the kind that people wear to excavations of gossip. It froze when he moved closer, whispering logistics I had not asked for and couldn't abide. The restaurant's soundtrack seemed to reorganize itself into a threat. The napkin in my lap crinkled in a way that sounded too loud. Tyler's breath smelled like citrus and a lie. "You think I'm a rat?" I asked, because I needed him to say it. If he said it, I could name it and refuse it. He didn't say it. He offered utility instead, titled it as a way to climb. Vincent Monroe's son was smooth, practiced. He had charm in a way that made it feel like betrayal and not coercion, and charm is the oldest trick in every dangerous man's playbook. When I stood up, the world tilted. My heel caught the hem of the dress, a whisper of silk against the floor that felt like a small rebellion. His hand slipped in front of me, not to stop me, but to make motion, to make a point. I moved out of it. The motion meant something to me. If I could not control where people put their hands, I could at least control how I moved away from them. That, I thought, would be the end of it. Then Tyler laughed, soft, confident, and said the words that made the room tilt again into something honed and dangerous. "You know he watches. He watches everyone." I tasted iron. The wine glass trembled in my hand and slipped from my fingers. It's always cinematic when something falls, glass shattering like a sudden accusation, red wine staining white linen, and the eye finding that color and holding it too long. I had expected Tyler to gloat. Instead, he looked almost weary, as though he were delivering a final, familiar line. I fled. It's a clumsy verb for what I did. I stood, I left money on the table, I pulled the collar of the coat I'd thrown over my shoulders up past my throat, and I walked out into the winter air like someone hoping to disappear in plain sight. The city had a night smell, exhaust, citrus from market stalls, the ghost of someone else's cigarette. My phone didn't ring for long. When Lorenzo's name did finally show, my chest did something I hadn't allowed it to do in a long time. Breathe. He said very little on the call. "Stay where you are," he told me, and his voice unpacked into my spine. low, certain, and far larger than the small woman who had been buying her own dresses just to mark small territories of defiance. There was a sound behind him, a door closing, a boot on stone, and then he was there. Lorenzo didn't make an entrance so much as reconfigure the air. One minute, the pavement was only wet and cold and me, and the next, there was a presence on my other side, a scent of tobacco and something citrus underneath, a hand at my elbow that felt like an anchor and a claim at once. His coat was charcoal, his jaw was shadow and intention. He looked at me in a way that read beyond the dress and the wine and straight into where I had tried to hide my fear. "You're bleeding," he said. It wasn't a question. He reached for my hand, gentle, almost clinical, and then he was guiding me to his car. I realized, later, that he'd been watching the restaurant not because he was possessive in a way most people would call monstrous, but because he had a ledger for risk nobody else could see. He called it protection. I called it a cage sometimes. Tonight, it felt like a coat thrown over a winter of sleeplessness. The ride to his place was silent in that particular language we had developed, the one where words were expensive and eyes did the negotiating. He kept his hand near my knee, not touching unless I moved closer. The building of his world moved fast in my head, a tower that had once been a bank, a doorman who knew the cadence of feet, a lobby that smelled like leather and paper money. He signed in at the desk without looking at the clerk. Marco, his driver, and the man whose face was all business, opened the elevator and slid behind us as if he belonged to the same shadow as Lorenzo. When we reached the penthouse, it was like stepping into someone's photograph, precise, curated, with objects placed as if to prove everything about the owner. The light inside softened the lines of Lorenzo's face. It softened the danger into something that could be held. He didn't leave me at the threshold. He closed the door with a minimal amount of noise and then watched me watch the room. There was a library wall that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and old paper, a table with a single espresso cup that told me he was back from somewhere, and a coat draped over the back of a chair that looked like it could tell secrets if I touched it. "You could have called Lucy," he said finally, meaning our receptionist. His voice was more observation than reprimand. I didn't have to explain that I'd chosen him because I needed him unfiltered, not through the safe distance of a message left at a desk. "I didn't call anyone," I replied. My body remembered the restaurant more vividly than my mind did. The way Tyler's charm had been too slick for my liking, the slow heat of panic in my palms. "I called you." "You always do," he said, and the corner of his mouth twitched in a way that was almost a smile and almost not. He sat me down on the leather couch and took off his jacket. He folded his hands around his cup and watched me as if intending to study the set of my jaw and the tremor in my fingers. It was the way he watched, so precise, so interested, that made my skin feel exposed and oddly flattered. "You could stay," he said, after a long minute. He said it as though he were offering me an umbrella in a storm. "Penthouse, for as long as you want." There was an argument to be made against it, a stack of reasons for leaving the scene to the ordinary people who lived ordinary nights. Those arguments glittered and then dissolved under the pragmatics of the city and my own brittle courage. I knew the ledger that lived in Lorenzo's brain. Threats cataloged, enemies filed away, resources aligned. To say yes was to step into that ledger. To say no was to walk back into a world where I'd been watched and almost traded like a token. "I'm not your plaything," I said instead, because I needed to place my foot against whatever small slide toward possessiveness might be forming. Saying it allowed the shape of me to remain something he had to earn, not the default answer to every invitation. He looked at me then, really looked. There was something almost soft about the way his fingers tightened once on the cup. "I don't want you to be," he said. "I want you to be safe, And I want you to be with me on terms that you set. The sentence should have been more balm than it was. It contained a possessive flatness that I didn't like, but it also carried a promise he'd seldom spoken out loud, that he would let me name the rules. I thought about the red dress folded in my bag, the way it had felt like a small rebellion, and the way rebellion often required allies. "Conditions?" I asked. "Name them," he replied. I told him the things I valued: transparency about who would know where I was, access to a way out if I wanted it, the right to go home whenever I wanted, no surprises about who slept in which rooms. I said no surveillance that couldn't be explained. I said no messages left on my phone that read like orders. I wanted to keep the things that were mine under my name. I wanted his protection without the cost of disappearing. He listened and did not argue. He made small concessions: an extra set of keys, a PIN that he would not know, Marco as a buffer for deliveries, a code word to signal discomfort. I could see him measuring each term against something I couldn't read: identity, reputation, an empire that ran on myth and fear. I saw, too, that making room for me inside his life required admitting he might be wrong about how to hold someone. When we talked about it, the room softened. We set boundaries as if threading them across the floor. Careful, deliberate, two people constructing a private map. The negotiation itself felt almost erotic in the way that two people in a dangerous game agree to rules before they play. It was intimate in a practical human way. I asked for agency, he agreed. Consent in this house was a small but vital currency. Then, because human beings seek comfort in the most dangerous places, we kissed. It began as a question, slow, testing, then deepened. Lorenzo's hands, which had been careful through negotiation, were suddenly gentle and sure. He asked for permission with a question muffled against my mouth, and I answered with the tilt of my chin and the surrender of my hands to the warmth of his neck. It was not a takeover. It was not coercion. It was two adults doing the strangely risky thing of letting themselves be found. Sex in Lorenzo's penthouse was different from frantic office trysts or late-night escapades I'd read about in other people's lives. It was commerce turned domestic. There were lit candles, the faint scent of bergamot that always seemed to announce him, and afterwards an awkwardness that felt like new customs being learned. I set my terms in the bed as surely as I had in the living room. No surprises in the morning, a discussion if things got complicated, an agreement that what happened between us didn't erase the rest of my life. He listened. He murmured things that were not promises about a future he was not ready to define. He put his palm flat on my belly and said my name in a voice that made me feel undated and dangerous at once. We fell asleep tangled and not afraid, an odd privilege I had not expected to grant myself. I woke to the smell of espresso, which came first as a practical fact, and then as a memory of how my hands used to be always on the cup at the office. The sun came in sideways through the blinds, striping the bedroom in gold. Lorenzo was already up, moving with the efficiency of someone who had always been responsible for other people's safety. Marco's muttered orders stitched the flat into the day's rhythm. There was a shopping list on the counter. There was an envelope with a small note that said, simply, rules. I read them propped at the kitchen island like an apprentice. Rule 1, transparency. Rule 2, no unilateral decisions about your whereabouts. Rule 3, always ask. There were more rules: practical, domestic, protective, and each one read like an invitation and a restraint, like everything about him, a man who lived by codes and sometimes wanted to be corrected. We ate poorly made eggs and excellent coffee. He watched me eat as though it amused him to see me take up space, to see me exist in the apartment in a way that was not filtered through work. I told myself he was just easing into the new terms as I was. There was a private lesson in folding your life into someone else's. It required a new grammar of give and take, and sometimes improvement. "Will you tell me about him?" he asked at one point, nodding toward my coat where the stain of wine still sat like a bruise. He wanted facts, the kind of currency he traded in. He was not asking to control, he was asking to understand the shape of the threat. "I'm not a file," I said, but I told him what I could. Tyler's smooth offers, the way he tried to recruit me as if my life were a lever he could pull for leverage. I told him how the wine had slipped and how I'd felt the panic like a physical thing moving up my throat. Each fact I offered was me building my defenses, naming the risk so that it could be cataloged and, perhaps, managed. He didn't take it as an excuse for violence. He took it as an explanation and then as an obligation. He talked logistics and the generalities of protection, not specifics, no how-tos, and Marco echoed him with a quiet competence. I appreciated the restraint. He could have turned the city into a chessboard with pieces picked up at his whim. Instead, he offered structure. Escorts for the times when I wanted company, a driver for late nights, a number that went to him directly if I ever felt unsafe. That was where I dug in my teeth and reasserted agency. "If you're protecting me," I told him, fixing him with the look I used when a client tried to overstep and I had to remind them of contract. "Let me decide when I need protection." He smiled in a way that acknowledged the bargain. "I'll provide the option," he said. "You'll take it, or you'll tell me why you don't." It was both generous and possessive. It was the kind of law that meant he would always offer, and I would always choose. Over breakfast, we drew the parameters like two generals who had decided to cease fire and then swap maps. The exercise made me both nervous and unaccountably calmer. If danger was a constant, at least it would no longer be a surprise. Days unspooled into a strange domesticity I hadn't expected to crave. I learned where he kept the sugar. He learned my favorite way to have coffee. Black, 2 spoons of sugar, a slow stir clockwise. We learned the small syntax of each other. When he was quiet, it meant planning. When he grunted, it meant he wanted something left of the table. When he kissed my temple, it meant he was checked into my world in a way deeper than the ledger. At the office, I kept my job. I still answered the phone with the same clipped, efficient cadence. I still filed contracts. I still erased clauses, and watched Lorenzo applaud me in a way that was both approving and possessive. There were whispers in the marble halls, Lucia's careful glances, Rosa's folded hands, and there were men who pretended not to notice me in the way a shark pretends not to notice blood. I learned to exist in both places, like a woman who had to be 2 things at once. There were nights when the watchfulness felt like a tether. I would stand at the window of his penthouse, look down at the city's glass and neon, and feel oddly free and oddly trapped. Some of the men who worked for him made practical jokes about his softness. Some of them didn't speak to me at all. Marco was never performative. Marco was functional. He handled the logistics without commentary. Lorenzo, on the other hand, was a performance of control that sometimes made me bristle. Other times, it made me feel held in a way I didn't know I had been aching for. But the ledger never closed. Tyler's smile had been a warning, not the last word. I would find notes left in my coat pockets, small threats veiled in civility, like a reminder that the city belonged to many hands and not all of them wanted us to be happy. I tried to file them like business memos, read, acknowledge, respond. But some things seared a different kind of mark. The red of the dress had a way of showing up in the smallest moments. A lipstick stain on a napkin, the flash of a tailcoat in a crowd, the red of a light that meant danger. One night, after a late dinner where the conversation had skidded into an argument about the rightness of the protection he offered, Lorenzo came to my desk without knocking. That was his quietest habit, walking into my clutter of files as if he always been the rightful occupant. He picked up a page at random and read my handwriting. I braced for the sort of comment that would reduce me to the neatness of an office supply. Instead, he said, "You made choices. I like that." I looked at him and registered how his jaw worked, the minute way his hand traced an invisible line on the back of his wrist. "I have to keep myself," I replied. "I won't be collateral." "You won't be," he said. The certainty in his voice landed like an order, but without the erasing I expected. It felt like a promise rearranged into a contract we both had to honor. We kissed then, softly, and it was neither a conquest nor a reprieve. It was the kind of contact that resembled a practical negotiation: consent given, boundaries outlined, surrender and return. When we finally broke apart, he asked me the one question that had been circling us from the beginning. "Do you want this?" he asked. The question was more than sexual. It was political, domestic, risky. It meant stepping into a life where every affection could carry consequence. It meant letting my choices be known and possibly weaponized. It meant choosing a man whose world had edges that cut. "Yes," I said, because I had thought it through enough to be certain, but on my terms. He smiled then, small, almost private, and nodded. For once, the ledger in his head had room for my handwriting. The next morning, I found an envelope on my desk. Inside was a single photograph of me in the dress from the restaurant, taken from across the table. On the back, in a handwriting that had the neatness of someone who intended to be terrifying, was one line: "We could have used you." I held the photo and felt something unfamiliar. Not fear exactly, but the prickling of being named in someone else's story. I knew then that the red dress hadn't been a small rebellion so much as a target. Tyler had not been the end of it. He was only a beginning. I took the photograph to Lorenzo. He looked at it briefly, then at me. His face didn't contort, his hand didn't clench. It was as if someone had shown him a bruise and he had already decided the treatment. "You tell me who took it." "I don't know," I answered. "You will tell me the next time you receive anything. You will not touch it with your bare hands again." He paused. "I will ask questions. You will answer." I told him I would, because there was no choice in the matter. But I also told him, firmly, like the contracts I'd learned to write, that he couldn't reduce me to a passive thing. "I will be protected," I said, "but I will still be me." He listened, and then he did something that surprised the office, and possibly himself. He laughed. It was quick, private, and not mocking. "Good," he said. "I prefer it when you are not a furniture piece." We had a way, then, of sharing the city with boundaries. He kept his distance where I demanded. I accepted his vigilance where it offered real safety. It was a tumultuous, tender centering that taught me how to be inside a man like Lorenzo without erasing the person I already was. The photograph led to questions that had to be answered in the style of his world: quiet, direct, and without spectacle. He made calls I couldn't hear and asked people to watch corners I never saw. He told me what he was doing only in the broadest strokes. It was maddening, which was a kind of intimacy I was not prepared for. To be protected and yet left out of the machinery that created that protection. One evening, a week after the restaurant, someone came to the office asking for me by name. The man at the front desk described him as a friend of Tyler's, casual, wearing a smile that suggested he expected the answer he wanted. "Lily's not here," Lucia said. The man's smile thinned. He left without making a scene, but the ripple of his presence remained like a dropped pebble on placid water. I called Lorenzo and told him. He came by the office that night in a way that made the men in suits look like children suddenly aware of a parent's presence. He did not make a show of the security he carried, though I could see the movement of the team in the margins. 2 cars that had been in the alley now steering away, eyes scanning. He stayed with me until the lights dimmed and the cleaners moved through the marble like ghosts. He let me lock the front door and he drove me home. When we reached my building, he did not ask me to move in. He had already offered. He did not ask me to renounce my life. He simply stood on my stoop and said quietly, "You're not alone." The street was damp. A cat threaded across the sidewalk, and a man argued with a cab driver a block over. He held my hand in a way that was not publicly possessive. It read as connection, a tether rather than a chain. I thought of the red dress folded in the back of my closet and felt the tug of something that both frightened and thrilled me. There is a peculiar courage in choosing danger with eyes open, in naming it and still deciding to stay. "Tomorrow," he said, "come by for dinner. Rosa will cook. We'll make it a normal night, or as normal as the Vitali household allows." I laughed, a small sound that released something tight in my chest. "I'm not sure what counts as normal around you." He shrugged, that slight lift of one shoulder that somehow always made him less like an idea and more like a person. "We'll fake it." I slept that night with the window cracked, the city breathing in and out, and with the knowledge that I was seen. It was hard sometimes to reconcile the man who could be patient and attentive with the ledger of his life that catalogued enemies and alliances like chess pieces. I could not unsee the way his eyes measured me, the way he catalogued risk. But I could also not unfeel the way his hand held mine, and how, in that simple contact, there was a promise of shelter. I went to the office the next morning and found a small plate on my desk with a silver pen laid on top. "For contracts you don't want me to sign for you." It was infuriating, oddly tender, and entirely Lorenzo. I smiled despite myself and pinned the photo of me in the dress back into the drawer. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had an ally in this dangerous city. I also felt the reality of the cost, which was that to be in his orbit was to be named in other people's stories, sometimes kindly, sometimes not. When Tyler's messenger left an unsigned card in my coat the following week, it read only, "You chose wrong." I took it to Lorenzo without hesitation. He didn't ask what the card said. He didn't need to. He put his hand on the card, and then he put his hand on mine. "You chose," he said, "and you'll live with the consequence, but you won't suffer them alone." I stayed because I had a choice, and because the choice felt like an act of agency. I stayed because I liked the way he taught me the rules of his life without entirely erasing mine. I stayed because sometimes safety is not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone who will face it with you. And yet, even then, in that fragile, negotiated space between desire and caution, I felt the city gathering its breath. There are nights when a photograph slides between your fingers and the world recalibrates. There are mornings when the coffee tastes like a warning. You learn, quickly, how to live with the knowledge that attention has a cost. I was at my desk when the call came, short, from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end spoke coolly, like a man reading from a script. "You work for Lorenzo Vitali," he said. "Yes," I replied, the one-word answer that is always both protection and exposure. "We need to talk," he said. "Tonight. No one else. Come alone." It was Tyler's friend again, or someone pretending to be. The city has 1,000 voices that sound like threats until they prove themselves otherwise. But the demands felt like a gauntlet thrown down. I should have said no. I should have told him I would never come alone again. I knew the consequences of walking into a meeting with a man who wanted leverage. I even knew the right calls to make, the names to ring. But there are times when defiance feels like dignity. There are times when you want to prove you are not the thing other people shove you into. I almost went. I didn't. I walked instead to a place I had promised I would not abandon. I called Lorenzo and told him what the man had said, the way you hand over a puzzle piece and ask someone else to place it where it belongs. "I told you to call me," he said, not with anger, but with a note that made me aware of all the moments I had been careless with my own safety. "I know," I said. I didn't want to be the woman who always needed a minder. You're not that woman, he corrected. You're the woman who knows the rules. Use them. We argued in small human ways. He wanted me to hand over the meeting. I wanted him to trust that I could say no. In the end, the argument itself felt like a test of the lines we had set. I told him I'd go if he came with me. He did not. He said he would send Marco. You'll be watched, he said, from a distance. I went anyway, because some stubbornness is not just a refusal, but an assertion of self. I arrived and found a booth in a diner that smelled of grease and orange cleaners. Tyler's friend sat opposite me with a coffee he didn't finish, and the conversation went through its motions. The bait, the attempted exchange, the suggestion that I could be useful. I answered politely, coolly, like the woman who wrote contracts for a living and knew how to terminate conversations with a clause. He slid a photograph across the table, grainy, taken in the dark, showing a door I recognized as the back of my building. My pulse did a small, ridiculous staccato. You could help us, he said. You could tell us how he moves, what he's planning. We'd be generous. I looked at him for a long time. Generosity was a currency I knew well in another man's world. It often came with conditions. I'm not for sale, I said. He laughed. No one's asking to buy you. We're asking you to be useful. Useful. It was as if the city reduced me to a tool, and all my choices were merely extensions of someone else's will. I felt the old bright anger that had made me buy the dress and cut the claws. It made my throat hot. I pushed the photograph back across the table. Leave it, I said. Tell Tyler to stop sending men. He smiled, small and thin, and said, You're not leaving us anything to bargain with. When I left, my hands shook. The diner was a bubble that popped when I stepped into the street. The night air felt too sharp. I walked faster than I should have, and when I turned the corner, there was a man standing where he shouldn't have been, a shadow too tall and too deliberate. Hello, Lily, he said, with a familiarity that felt like a trap. My phone vibrated at my hip. Marco's name lit the screen. Don't move, the text said. I didn't. I felt a presence behind me and heard a car start in the distance. Marco's car. Lorenzo's timbre of impatience in the hallway of my head. The man watched me for a long enough moment to make a threat, then stepped back into the dark. It was an ordinary thing in our city to have a shadow retreat because it wasn't time to take a step forward. When I reached the car, I realized I had nearly made the choice I always claimed I would not, to face danger alone, to prove I was not small. I breathed and allowed myself to be led back into the world Lorenzo made for me, complicated, dangerous, and oddly, a place where my agency was both limited and fiercely defended. That night, when we returned to the penthouse, Lorenzo didn't ask many questions. He didn't need to. The look on my face told him more than any list could. He lit a cigarette and watched me as if watching would rearrange the facts into order. You told me, he said after a long minute. I nodded. I wanted to. He crushed the cigarette in the ashtray and put his hand over mine. Good, he said. We do this together from now on. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe I had found not just a protector, but a partner. But the city does not surrender its threats because two people have agreed to share a bed. It merely remaps them. He kissed the back of my hand and, privately, fiercely, promised to keep me safe. I believed him as much as I could, which is to say, I trusted him enough to sleep. Around midnight, when the city had thinned and the penthouse hummed with the low sound of ventilation, a single envelope arrived on the doormat. It was slipped in under the door, anonymous and small. I opened it with fingers that betrayed a flutter I tried to hide, and found a card inside with one sentence written in block letters, "We don't forget." It was a threat, precise and unornamented. It was a world I had chosen to step into, and a reminder that nothing in that world came without consequence. I took the card to Lorenzo and laid it on the table between us. He read it slowly, then looked at me. "You could leave," he said. "Where would I go?" I asked. "You could go anywhere," he replied. "But I understand if you'd rather stand and fight." "I'd rather choose," I said. He gave a breath that pulled something from his chest and placed it between us. "Then choose," he said, "every day. But know one thing, I won't let them use you." I believed him because I gave my belief where it mattered. I stayed, in part because the penthouse had a warm linen that felt like a promise, and in part because I was tired of running. But the card sat on the table like an accusation. The red dress hung in the closet like a small, defiant flag. I understood with the peculiar clarity of someone who had just signed a contract with an undertow that my choices had set a course I couldn't simply reverse. Behind closed doors, in the quiet when the city's teeth clicked and sheathed, we negotiated the terms of our new life. He taught me the language of risk in parables and metaphors rather than in tactics. I taught him to ask permission. The arrangement was messy and human, and, for reasons I still sometimes didn't understand, felt right. Then, one morning as I prepared Lorenzo's espresso the way I had for years, a ritual I'd held like a talisman, Marco came into the kitchen with a look on his face that made the room tilt. "Vincent Monroe was found dead," he said. The words landed like a stone in a glass. For a heartbeat, I didn't know which noise to hear first, the drip of espresso, the clink of the spoon, the sudden absence of breath. The city outside the penthouse felt suddenly too small and too loud at once. There was a history in those names, a weight I'd only just started to comprehend. Lorenzo's hand tightened on his cup. He didn't move, but his face was a map of calculation. The ledger in his mind opened with the rustle of paper. "Where?" I asked. And the question was small and huge at once. "His house," Marco said. "He was killed overnight." The room condensed into a single bright point. The photo from the dress slid in my memory, and the tiny threats that had begun as whispers and then became declarations. For a moment, the world was very small and very loud all at once. The hiss of the espresso, the clink of the spoon against the cup, the steady, small breath of the penthouse like a lung. Marco's voice had sounded flat across the kitchen, like a headline you didn't want to read but couldn't ignore. Vincent Monroe was dead, killed overnight, said as if the death were a fact and not an instruction to everyone it touched. Lorenzo set the cup down with a sound that ought to have been ordinary and wasn't. His fingers left a ring of heat on the porcelain. He folded his hands like someone folding a map. For a second, I thought he might say nothing at all. Then his face moved, a slow, careful rearrangement of muscle I had learned to read the way other people read weather. "We'll go," he said, simply. We were at the funeral 3 days later. The Monroes had a way of arranging grief like a statement. Black suits, pressed shirts, the kind of stoicism that worked as armor. I wore something practical, a dark sheath, minimal jewelry, hair pinned back. The red dress lived in my drawer at the penthouse like a loaded memory. I thought about it a lot those days, about the way red caught a light and refused to let it go. There were people who would see the color and judge decisions I had not yet made. The room smelled faintly of lilies and the expensive cologne men used to signal seriousness. Lorenzo moved with the economy of someone who belonged to a different class of ceremony. He stood in the back and looked at the family as if cataloging pages in a book that had been written years earlier. Faces I'd seen in files and at meetings passed by. Vincent's brothers, men who were used to carrying resentment like a second skin. The seat where Vincent had sat in the past at functions was an ache in the room. Someone tapped my elbow. Lucia, small and careful, hovered in the periphery. "Are you all right?" she whispered. "Yes," I said. It was a word that felt like a bandbox over a bruise. I wasn't all right, but I had learned how to present myself in increments. Lorenzo's presence near me felt like a promise and like a weight, all at once. Then the whisper started, not quiet rumors, but the kind of soft conversation that behaves like a tide. It moved around the room in currents. I heard my name, I heard the name Lorenzo, and a pattern of inference folding neatly around it. Men who had never met me had already decided what I must mean to the Vitali ledger. There was a small human cruelty to how easily people could write you into someone else's story. That night, after the ceremony had collapsed into stoic handshakes and the family had driven away, Lorenzo pulled me aside into a back room, an office lined with books and the kind of leather seating that made even casual conversation feel like negotiation. "They'll point where it's useful," he said. "They'll look for blood where they can score points." "I know," I said. I had seen it already, the way tongues were sharpened to use men as fulcrums in their fights. "They'll want your downfall, use anything that moves." He looked at me then, and his expression folded like something being closed to protect the interior. "They'll try to make it mine." He didn't say framed, he didn't have to. I could see the ledger tilt as he considered the cost. In our world, a death like Vincent's could be a scarlet flag for the press, for rivals, for men who preferred that chaos bloom in someone else's yard. Someone wanted blame to land somewhere, and Lorenzo had enough enemies that the guesswork could be cruel. The next morning, the headlines were tidy and sensational, the city hungry for confirmation. "Vital link sought," read the paper snippets that slid across my social feeds like so many knives. I knew better than to feed on them. Still, I felt each line as a small cut. Rosa called with practicalities. Marco sent terse updates that arranged like military dispatches. Lorenzo moved through the week with a stillness that was both terrifying and steady. There were no grand promises. There were only controlled reactions, and the kind of planning that smelled faintly of risk. We were moved that afternoon. I didn't argue. It felt foolish to posture about independence when someone had died and the ripples had already reached our shore. We went to a safe house that Lorenzo's people kept, a modest townhouse that wore a kind of domestic disguise. It had curtains that blocked line of sight and a kitchen that was intentionally unremarkable. Rosa helped me pack as if we were attending a funeral for my previous life. A toothbrush, a few blouses, the red dress folded last and placed in a plastic bag like evidence. "You sure about the dress?" Rosa asked with a tiny smile that was almost apologetic. She knew what it meant to keep a red thing hidden. "Yes," I said. It was strange to defend an object. The dress was a hinge in the story, a memory spun into cloth. Not everything in my closet is a target. Lorenzo watched us pack from the doorway, arms folded, contained. He never asked me to give up the dress. He asked only that I let him know when I wore it. We had become our own treaty. He offered protection, I offered choice. Sometimes treaties need reminding. The first night in the safe house was a false calm. We ate takeout in matching paper boxes and watched a program I couldn't follow. Lorenzo's phone barely left his hand. He was quiet but not absent. He spoke in broad strokes about the world outside, the people who might want blood. He didn't name the Russos. He didn't make accusations. He kept to the ledger. Then evidence started to show itself. The way a patient reveals a hidden wound, in small, clinical things. A video from a street camera showed a car in the neighborhood the night Vincent died. Not the car specifically, but its outline. A witness, asked by one of Marco's men to remember a face, remembered a man with the angular jaw of someone who had been to the gym a lot and who laughed loudly at small jokes. The clues were not clear instructions. They were hints you could choose to read or not. Marco and Lorenzo sipped them like bitter coffee and looked at the margins. "What's the angle?" I asked once, because there is only so much stoicism one can tolerate from the inside. Lorenzo's eyes moved to mine, the way they always did when he wanted to keep me in the loop without making me complicit in details I didn't need. "Someone wants us to burn," he said. "They want an excuse for war or to make us bleed reputation." "You think it was the Russos?" I asked. It felt reckless to name a family. They were not chess pieces. They were men and women with sons and grudges. I wanted to be careful with names. I don't like naming without proof, he replied, but the pattern fits, and you were a convenient symbol. That word landed inside me, convenient. I was not a symbol. I was a person who had chosen danger and then paid attention to its edges. The thought of being moved like a piece unsettled me. I wanted to be useful in a way that was not purely reactive. So make them see you're not an easy target, I said. He smiled a small, almost private smile. You always have the best ideas. When we left the safe house 2 nights later, it was not because danger had left us. It was because the ledger had stirred. Marco had found something, a scrap of paper, a receipt, a man on the edge of memory who said the name Russo and then looked away. It wasn't a smoking gun. Nothing in our world was ever clean, but it was a lead. The meeting with the Monroes happened in a room that smelled of old money and new resentment. Men sat like judges, the air was tight with diplomacy that was really posturing. I wore the red dress that night, not out of defiance, but because I wanted to see how decisions felt on my skin. Lorenzo watched me as I smoothed the fabric with my hands, as if checking the seams of both the dress and me. Lily, Vincent's brother said, and the name landed like a formal address. We need assurances. Lorenzo spoke first, cutting through the room with a voice that managed diplomacy and threat at once. He presented the facts we had, sparse, precise, cobbled from interviews and the private surveillance that men like Marco kept. He didn't accuse the Russos outright. He offered evidence in a way that suggested an invitation to logic rather than a demand for blood. When he finished, there was the small pause of men who are used to making decisions like weather. Eyes moved. The Monroes' counsel, old and careful, asked for more time. The room hummed with the politics of not yet. For a moment, it seemed we might stave off immediate conflict. But then, someone at the edge of the table, a man who always favored bold gestures, leaned forward and said, with too much warmth, "You know, it looks bad." His tone meant, it looks like Vitali was involved. I felt a hot prickling in my hands. The red dress felt like a signal. I had chosen it earlier as a personal act. Here, it read like a provocation. Lorenzo glanced at me briefly, just the fraction of a second that told me he registered both my discomfort and the advantage in the optics. He had the patience to wait and the will to act when waiting was a liability. After the meeting, in the hushed corridors, a journalist's camera had already taken a photograph that would be printed the next day. Me in red, Lorenzo at my side, a caption promising scandal. The world will always make a story of the easiest narrative, and ours was begging to be simplified. The next week, some of that simplification began to snag on the wrong edges. A forensic report leaked, not by Lorenzo's men, and it put a piece of evidence in a narrative that pointed toward us. I remember reading the headline and feeling my stomach tilt, as if the world had been rearranged. The leak was precise, the kind that seemed designed to do damage. And the damage was not just to Lorenzo's reputation. It landed like a bruise on the people orbiting him, people like me. "You want to run?" Rosa asked one night as she packed a small bag again. Her hands were fast, efficient, and practiced in the way of women who had to be prepared. "No," I said. "I don't think running is a solution anymore." She sighed, not surprised. She'd seen the shape of my stubbornness when I'd moved into that penthouse and announced my conditions. "Well, if you're staying," she said, "you can at least stop wearing red to family meetings." I laughed then, sharp and unsteady. I wanted to tell her the dress had been a small victory, a line I had drawn that said I could still choose. I didn't want to give it up because men in suits had decided my color choice had been childish and dangerous. But I also understood optics. There was a craft to being present in dangerous rooms. You had to know when to become visible and when to be a shadow. Lorenzo and his team collected what they could. Marco was tireless in that way, that made him less of a person and more of a force. He followed leads, negotiated favors like currency, and prodded stubborn witnesses into telling stories they'd been paid to forget. The more he scraped, the more the pattern began to form. Names that trailed back to the Russo family in ways that were not neat but were consistent. When the proof arrived, it was not cinematic. It was a photograph of a bill for a rental car, a ledger entry scrawled in an office we had no business reading, an errand from a man who had once bragged about being untouchable and was suddenly not. Marco placed the documents in front of Lorenzo with the blunt ceremony of someone presenting evidence in a trial. "They hired muscle," he said, "not Vitali, not our men." Lorenzo leaned back and let the facts settle into his face. I watched him the way you watch a machine you love that has been damaged, with sadness and fierce determination. "Will they admit it?" he asked. "Not willingly," Marco replied, "but families talk when they think their names will be burned." The meeting Lorenzo arranged to confront the Russos was as public as he could make it without turning it into a spectacle. He wanted acknowledgement, not necessarily blood. He wanted the family to understand they had used a death as fuel for a fire they had not intended to start. He wanted the ledger to be set straight before men who liked the tidy narrative could use it. We went to the palazzi, which felt like a museum to power. Marble, portraits, the kind of quiet that remembers old agreements. The Russo patriarch was there in a room lined with men who looked like they'd been carved from granite. Tyler was not there, which made sense. He was a small man with bigger friends. He had already begun the process of being a person too ambitious for his reach. Lorenzo presented the evidence with the calm native to him. There was no grand gesture, no shouting. He laid out a sequence: payments, people, a small set of names. He spoke with the precision of someone who had spent a life in ledger lines and consequence. The Russo spokesman, a woman with an ability to remain inscrutable, listened with a face that gave nothing away. "We can deny it," she said finally, "or we can admit the error and stop the rumor." There was a long breath in that room, held and released like a held grudge. Families, we learned, have a way of moving past explosive moments when the cost of war suddenly becomes too high. The evidence had not been conclusive enough to force confession under oath, but it had been specific enough to make the Russos admit to a connection in a way that let them bow out without losing face. It was a strange kind of defeat, clean on paper, bloody in private. In the end, words were exchanged, an admission disguised as regret, a payment, men in dark suits promising quiet. The newspapers spun it as a cooling of tensions. The families did what families do. They rearranged, negotiated, redefined losses. The message that was supposed to be ours, Lorenzo's culpability, was deflected just enough to keep the city from tipping toward open war. But victories in our world are always partial. The press had its red meat. There were men who still believed the worst because it fit their view of the world. Men with grudges don't lay them down because a ledger gets corrected. And the cost was not abstract. It came in small, private ways. A driver who suddenly refused to take routes once a child of a rival family passed the same sidewalk. A friend who asked if I was really safe to be seen with my boss. Reputation is a thing that drips away, not in torrents. Once the immediate danger calmed, Lorenzo continued to shift. He talked about legitimacy in a way that had not been in his voice before, or at least not in a voice I had heard. In quiet hours, he spoke about businesses that weren't built on fear, about plans that would not require men like Marco to solve problems with muscle. The idea of a life where he could cross a street without measuring the angle of threat felt startling and, to be honest, almost like hope. "You could do it," I said one night as we stood at the kitchen counter and split a takeout pizza because Rosa had failed to deliver dinner on time. "Do what?" he asked. "Step out of the ledger. Build something that doesn't need a ledger." He laughed, A small, almost tender sound. You make it sound so easy. It's not easy, I said. It's necessary if you want to last. He considered the idea, and in the private way he had of making big things feel like plausible next steps, he began to talk about how he'd done deals in the open before, how he'd moved money into legitimate enterprises, and how the penultimate transition for him would be to be known for productivity rather than fear. I listened like someone watching a map be redrawn. I also watched him pivot in small mercies. When he found an article that mentioned me in a way I didn't like, he called the editor and arranged a correction. He hired a team to handle public relations. He made sure Rosa had new clients. It was the kind of domestic tending he had not been known for. It made me feel both cherished and alarmed. Change is a dangerous thing when you've built an identity on consistency. In that quiet rebuilding, our relationship matured in the way that two people who share a life do, through negotiations, through apologies, through the clumsy habit of learning each other's edges. He taught me how to read meetings from the margins. I taught him how to ask for consent in a world that usually assumed compliance. We became partners in the literal sense. He protected, I advised. He listened, I negotiated. There was sex sometimes, tender or fierce depending on the weather of our days, always explicit in consent. And there were quieter moments, coffee shared at 4 in the morning, the two of us making lists about which investments would be legitimate enough and lucrative enough to move his enterprise into daylight. Tyler faded into the background. He was a small figure who belonged to a small world, and in the end, his choices made him smaller. He tried petty retaliation, threats, a smear that landed like an insect on the surface of our reputation. But men like Tyler get eaten by their own hunger if they lack enough patience or power. He had neither. I saw him once after the confrontation with the Russos, sitting in a bar too small and too loud for a man used to grandeur, nursing a drink as if it could patch everything. He was younger than I'd imagined, and his bravado was the brittle thing of youth. One night, after a day of meetings where Lorenzo had made motions toward legitimization, shell companies restructured, harmless investments renamed, I found a photograph slipped under the penthouse door. It was a picture of the restaurant where Tyler and I had had that first night. The edges had been torn. On the back, in the same neat hand that liked to make men nervous, was written, "Choose carefully." I laughed, short and incredulous. He never learned to leave anything unsaid, I told Lorenzo. He took the photograph without touching it with his fingers, as if the paper itself might be a contagion. People like him, he said, leave messages because they think noise will drown out consequences. And does it? I asked. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't parse. Not for long, he said. We decide which noises matter. The restaurant that had once been the theater for my indignity soon became the place where he would choose to let me be publicly seen on more intentional grounds. He wanted a clean marker, a night that would be mine, not a man's act of coercion. He wanted to give the red dress back to me as a thing I owned, rather than a thing used to mark me. He asked me one evening if I would go with him to dinner there. The request was casually phrased, as if it were a small preference rather than a setting of a stage. I thought about saying no. The numbing of that early date had been sharp and unkind. But I also thought about the audacity of choosing to wear the red dress on my terms. I thought about my agency and how sometimes agency means stepping into spaces you once ran from. I said yes. I wore the dress finally at a time I chose. The restaurant's lighting remembered me and made the dress a statement. I felt the fabric settled against my skin the way an armor could be soft and audacious at once. Lorenzo arrived shortly after me, as he had in the beginning, quiet, consuming, his presence rearranging the room. He sat across from me and ordered with the same economy that characterized him. At one point during dinner, when a waiter moved too quickly, a man at the bar made an offhand remark about the company of powerful men and women. He meant it to be a joke. He meant it to highlight a rumor. I heard it, and I felt something like an old reflex. Anger raised along with the thought, do I let men make my life a topic for them? Lorenzo's hand covered mine across the table then, simple, firm, and he leaned closer in a way that made the man at the bar stop mid-laugh. He looked at me with a question in his eyes that was not about possession, but about whether I wanted him to act. "I'm fine," I whispered. He smiled, and the world arranged itself around that small sign of consent. "I know," he murmured. "I'm just making sure." That night, it was not about a confrontation with secrets. It was about the choice to be seen in a way I chose. Behind doors, before the world could make a story of it, Lorenzo and I agreed, again and again, about the terms of our union: transparency, respect for boundaries, and a desire to build something that could survive daylight. Months folded into a rhythm of the bizarre normal: clandestine negotiations and breakfast at home, threats that showed up like weather, and days of dull office work. I learned more about the legitimate side of his world. He taught me when to sign a paper, when to read a clause, when to walk away. I found I liked the power of knowledge, the way legalese organized the world into lines I could navigate, rather than into threats I had to dodge. Lorenzo, slowly, began to open his empire to daylight investments: a restaurant here, a shipping line there, a legitimate facade that would, in time, do more than hide. It would transform. He surprised me once by telling me he wanted to marry me. He did it the way he did most of the difficult things, not as a decree, but as a question. We had been sitting at the restaurant again, the same one where I'd once been nearly recruited by Tyler, and the candles made the table feel like a private island. He ordered nothing extravagant. He slid his fork aside and looked at me. "Will you marry me?" he asked. It was both simple and enormous. There were conditions implied: a life that might be more public, a life where being my partner meant added exposure. We had discussed partnership like business partners before. This was different. This was political and domestic and life-altering. I laughed then, surprised, a sound that revealed the shape of the question in me. "Do you mean that you want me?" I said, "or that you want the paperwork that will make you less dangerous?" He smiled, the corner of his mouth tipping in the way that meant he was pleased to be teased. "Both," he said. "I want you, I want the paperwork. Mostly, I want the thing in the middle, someone who stands with me because they choose it, not because they are afraid." There was a tenderness in that I hadn't predicted, an honesty that felt like a bridge. "I'll marry you," I said, after a long breath, "on the condition that you keep promising to let me be me." He took my hand across the table and held it as if sealing a pact. "I promise," he said. It was a promise not only to me, but to the possibility of a future he had not permitted himself before. The proposal was private and small, and in that quietness it felt like the most radical act we had done. There were no fireworks, no speeches, just two people making a choice that would bind them legally and intimately. The wedding was later, carefully arranged in a small ceremony that struck a compromise between opulence and privacy. Few photographed it, fewer knew the full story. Rosa arranged flowers that smelled like summer. Lucia read a poem someone had recommended. Marco stood at the edge like a guardian who would always be a little out of the frame. We had decided on a small guest list: family we trusted, friends who had watched us navigate the past storms. I wore the red dress again for the rehearsal, a private joke between us about how far we'd come. For the ceremony itself, I chose something softer, not because I had given up the audacity of red, but because I wanted to signal something else, a new beginning. Lorenzo watched me walk down the aisle like a man who would, forever, read the small details and catalog them as treasures. We married with vows that were not lofty promises of perfection. We promised to be honest. We promised to keep boundaries. We promised to choose one another every day, recognizing that choosing a man like Lorenzo came with the cost of a life that would never be simple. We promised to protect one another, and we promised, no less importantly, not to erase the other. After the ceremony, we returned to the penthouse to sleep as husband and wife. The city glittered below like an argument. The world outside did not stop being dangerous. There were still threats in corners, scratches on the face of our plans, but there was also a bed where two people owned each other in a contract of consent and choice. We lay tangled afterwards, the room humid with the slow disintegration of the day's adrenaline. Lorenzo traced the line of my jaw with a finger, as if mapping something new. "You still keep that dress," he said, suddenly, as if thinking aloud. "Yes," I said, "and you keep your ledger." He let out a breath that was part laugh, part exhale. "A gentleman's agreement," he said. "Gentleman," I teased. He kissed me then, soft, the kind that looks like an apology for all the times he'd been less gentle. We talked about the future in small increments. Maybe a restaurant in Naples, maybe an import business with clean books, maybe a day when the name Vitali meant something other than an inventory of fear. In the months that followed, the city continued to hum with its petty cruelties and high dramas. Men still tried to use our story for leverage. A few months in, a younger man with connections tried to push his way into a business Lorenzo had acquired. He misjudged his reach. He was warned gently, and then from another angle. He learned that some fights were not worth the grief. The lesson was simple. Leverage only goes so far in a city that likes to pretend chaos is glamorous. As for Tyler, his small rebellions ended quietly, in a way that was ugly and didn't make good copy. He left town the way poor men leave town, with a head bowed and debts unpaid. I felt no gloating, only a tiredness and the relief that some snares could be avoided. We settled into a domesticity that was not the kind written about in romance novels. It was stark and sometimes messy. We argued about bills. We argued about which renovations were too ostentatious. We argued about the right amount of security for my office. He learned patience in ways that had nothing to do with money. How long to listen when I needed to articulate a fear. How not to move before I gave consent. And I learned the blurry lines of power. How to wield influence without becoming what I resented. I used my role, both as his partner and someone who still wrote contracts, to nudge deals into the light that had once been done in the dark. It felt like working on an old machine. Careful lubrication, new parts. Sometimes it failed and needed more than that, but slowly things changed. The city never fully relaxed. There were nights when an envelope showed up under the door, an anonymous note promising retribution. There were news cycles that briefly made us the subject of gossip. Men with old grudges still paced the margins. But the frequency dulled. The ledger that ran Lorenzo's life began to show entries that looked less like disputes and more like investments and dividends. It was not redemption. Redemption is a pagan word in our circles. It was incremental, the slow, stubborn reconstruction of a life. I sometimes thought about the red dress when I closed my closet. It had followed me through a strange transition, from rebellion to weapon to symbol to something I reclaimed. I kept it for the years when I needed proof that I had chosen my life deliberately. I kept it for the nights when I wanted to remember the first time I felt watched and then chose to be seen. Behind closed doors, we traded whispers and the private truth that danger and tenderness can coexist. He could still be possessive in the raw moments when fear cut deep. I would call him on it. He would learn and sometimes fail and then try again. The woman I had been, the one who'd walked into a restaurant with boldness and come out with blood on a napkin, still lived in me. I had not become merely someone's wife or someone's ornament. I remained a person who could choose, disagree, negotiate, and leave if the cost ever became too high. We taught each other how to be human in a situation that would have erased the humanity from lesser people. The nights when he sat up quietly and listed the men he wanted to keep away from me, I would remind him the names of the people I wanted to keep close. Rosa, Lucia, Marco, the small constellation that held us together. He learned the value of friends who are not extensions of power, but people. Years later, on a Thursday that began like any other, Espresso, the hum of the city, a fold in a life I had not expected. I made an omelet for him because he liked it the way he always did. Folded twice, a small pinch of parsley. He thanked me in the old, half-joking way he sometimes used, like a man who still enjoyed the small rules of domesticity. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked, surprising myself by the bluntness of the question. It was the kind of question that had gravity, marrying a man with a ledger, choosing a life with real costs. He considered the omelet, then my face. "I regret the mornings I'm not with you," he said. The answer was not a sweeping romanticism. It was practical, as most of his best things were. It landed heavy with meaning. I thought about the men we'd been, both of us rawer, angrier, less generous, and the people we were trying to become. "So do I said, "and I don't regret the rest." There are days when love is a light you can carry, and other times when it's a tool, something you use to do better work. We continued to live with the knowledge that danger was possible, that the city would flex and test us. We kept the alarms in place, not as a sign of paranoia, but as a small practicality. We practiced consent like an exercise, checking in, asking, negotiating. We honored the bargain we had struck at the beginning, not the one of power and ledger, but the one where we would choose each other with eyes wide open. Sometimes people ask me, with the kind of curiosity that smells like warning, whether I am happy. It's a hard question, because happiness is not a continuous line in our life. We are stitched together with small joys and large sacrifices. But when I look at Lorenzo in the early mornings, pouring his second espresso with a concentration that could be worship, when he hums an old song from a smaller life, when he watches me sign a contract with the careful pride of a man watching his favorite thing succeed, then I know the answer. I am content. More than that, I am chosen, and I have chosen. Neither of us is without cost. We pay them, we bargain, we survive. If anything, the lesson was this: danger does not mean a life without love. It simply means love is a strand woven into a fabric that has to be strong enough to hold both softness and steel. We learned to accept that. We learned to build around it, to keep the red dress in the drawer and sometimes wear it when the world allowed it, on our terms. The city still whispered. There were still envelopes and anonymous hands. There were still men who misunderstood the right to choose. But behind closed doors, literal doors, heavy doors that kept out prying eyes and idle malice, we had a different world. It was a world where I could be both Lorenzo's secretary and his partner, where I had a voice in the ledger and a name that didn't belong to a family's rumor. One night, lying awake as the city breathed, Lorenzo turned to me and said, half asleep, "Do you remember the first night you called me?" "Every goddamn song," I replied, like a hymn you can't stop humming. He smiled in the dark, the kind of smile that makes your chest loosen because it means you are allowed to stay. "Good," he said, "because I keep meaning to tell you thank you." "For what?" I asked. "For choosing me," he said, "and for choosing yourself." I turned toward him, bumping into the familiar weight of his shoulder. "I chose both," I said, and that was the point. Outside, the city sparkled in the language of a million other stories. Inside, the penthouse held a quiet like the eye of a storm. Noisy, yes, and dangerous, but also intimate and deliberate. That, I thought, was all we could ever ask for. A choice made and remade over and over, with consent where it mattered, with agency preserved, and with the stubborn audacity to wear red when we wanted, not because we were told to, not because someone else used it as punctuation, but because it felt like mine. If you liked this story and crave more dangerous romances with complicated choices and dark tenderness, subscribe and watch the playlist for similar tales.